This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Good evening. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Ethan Rarick, the director of the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service, part of the Institute of Governmental Studies here on campus. I want to welcome you to the Spring 2014 Matsui Lecture. The Matsui Lectureship brings to campus distinguished former members of Congress for one-week residencies. During that week, they meet with student groups, they speak to classes, they deliver the Matsui Lecture, but more than that, they bring to the campus their practical, real-world experience in public service and thereby further the purpose of the Matsui Center, which is to encourage Cal students in their interest in public service and hopefully encourage some of them to go into public service someday. For any students who are here, I would encourage you to go to our website, well, for everyone, but especially for students, go to our website, politics.berkeley.edu, and you'll find information about our internship programs, our public events, all of our programs, and I hope you'll take advantage of that. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, let me quickly handle a couple of logistical matters. The normal request to please silence your cell phones or turn them off or break them into small pieces or whatever you want to do, but let's not have them going off, please. The second logistical matter is questions. After the congressman speaks, we're going to take some questions. We're actually going to distribute, I think they may have already been distributed. If not, you can raise your hand. We're going to distribute note cards. I see somebody has one, to write questions on. At the end of the congressman's talk, we're going to collect those, and they'll be brought up to me, and I'll read some of them, and he'll take those questions. Now to introduce tonight's speaker. Howard Berman was born and raised in Los Angeles. He became active in Democratic politics when he was a student at UCLA. While there, he also befriended Henry Waxman, who also went on to a long career, of course, in the Congress. Congressman Berman later attended the UCLA School of Law, and then after practicing law, began a career in elected office that would eventually span for 40 years. He was served 10 years in the California legislature, and then beginning in 1982, he served 30 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was known throughout that time as one of the most substantive and respected and serious members of the House, focused on a wide variety of policy areas, including intellectual property, copyright law, and immigration reform. However, most relevant for tonight's lecture is that he also was a longtime member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and was chairman of the committee from 2008 until 2011. During that time, he played a particularly important role in increasing, which I'm sure he will talk more about, in increasing sanctions on and isolation of Iran as it moved forward with its nuclear program. So he is both one of the country's leading experts on foreign affairs generally and an expert on Iran's nuclear program in particular, and so he is especially equipped to talk about tonight's topic, responding to Iran's nuclear ambitions, diplomacy, sanctions, and other alternatives. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Howard Berman.
Well, thank you very much, Ethan. Initially, I have to say that term expert, knowing more than most of your colleagues in Congress does not allow you to call yourself an expert. It's a low threshold. No. First, I just wanted to start out by thanking very much the Matsui family for sort of, I guess, awarding me or rewarding me with this role this week, and Ethan Rarick, who's he and his staff have treated me so well, I almost think I'm still in public office, and the Institute for Government Studies, which I was mentioning It was that institute, when I first got elected to Congress in 1982, that did an orientation session for new members from the California delegation, and there were a lot in 1982 down at UC San Diego, and the leader of the institute, Nelson Polsby, came down and ran that program and developed a relationship with him, which just was wonderful for me in so many different ways. So it's nice to be here now in the auspices of the Institute and the Matsui Center. In my 30 years as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which Ethan mentioned, my 3 years as chairman, and the last 2 as a ranking member of that committee, and I might point out it is better to be chairman than ranking member. One of the most complicated issues that I dealt with was the U.S. effort to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. It has also been one of the most important, and I've been working on this issue really since the mid-1990s. Let me start with some guiding principles and beliefs on this topic. Some may challenge the assumptions that I make, but I think there's a compelling case that they're valid. And the first principle is that Iran is and has been engaged in an intensive effort to master the entire process for constructing nuclear weapons and their delivery systems, so that if and when the Supreme Leader decides that he wants them, Iran could put together that nuclear weapon arsenal and the means to deliver them very quickly. Iran wants to be, at the very least, a threshold nuclear state. Iran claims that all of its work has been and is being done to develop nuclear energy, but those claims simply are not credible. Tehran's enrichment program and the construction of the Iraq heavy water facility are totally inconsistent with a desire to simply be a country that has an nuclear energy capability. The second principle is that it's a vital security interest of the United States to stop Iran's efforts to develop nuclear weapons. Often this discussion focuses exclusively on Israel and U.S. support for our close Middle East ally. After all, Iranian leaders have at various times threatened to wipe Israel off the map, and nuclear weapons delivered by long-range missiles are the vehicle which they might try to use for that purpose, not to mention their financing and support for groups that are implacably opposed to the presence of Israel in the Middle East. But there are many other U.S. security interests at stake which do not involve Israel. In my opinion, Iran's attempt to develop nuclear weapons is far more troublesome for the United States than anything North Korea has done. And North Korea's program is definitely troublesome. The other important nations of the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, longtime allies of the United States, understand that the Iranian regime has hegemonic designs in the region. If Iran does obtain these weapons of mass destruction, there is no doubt that some or all of these nations will develop nuclear weapons as well. The nuclear proliferation in the Middle East will be truly frightening. The region will no longer be the power keg it is now. It will become a nuclear powder keg. And the non-proliferation regime, under serious stress now, will have totally collapsed. Even worse, there will be no effective ways for these nations to safeguard their nuclear weapons. We will face a much greater risk of them falling into the hands of al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations. Third, Iran's nuclear ambitions must be viewed in the context of the intense animosity between Shia and Sunni. Their hatred goes back to 632 AD, the death of the Prophet Muhammad, The most critical issue following Muhammad's death was his succession. The forebears of the Sunnis followed the tribal tradition of having a council of elders select as the head of the Islamic community the individual most qualified to lead. The forebears of the Shia sect, on the other hand, believed that Muhammad's heirs should rule the Islamic community. The conflict came to a head in the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD, when the Sunnis' forebearers massacred the Prophet's grandson Hussein and his followers. Caliphally, the victors carried Hussein's head to Damascus and paraded it there. Is it any wonder that for the next 1,300 years, there has been hatred and recurring warfare between these two sects within Islam who differ radically in their religious practices? Their battles have been particularly intense in the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, and explain much of what has been happening in the Middle East. In Iraq, for example, the current violence is between Maliki, Prime Minister, a Shia, and Sunnis trying to bring down his government. In Syria, it is Assad from the offshoot Shia sect of Alawites, again being challenged by Sunni warriors. In Lebanon, the frequent deadly bombings and assassinations are another manifestation of the Sunni-Shia conflict. Iran is playing a critical role in these conflicts and almost all others in the Middle East. That's because Iran, whose citizens are Persian and not Arabic, are almost all Shia. The Iranians see themselves as the leaders of the Shia in this deadly struggle with the Sunnis. They support Maliki in Iraq, Assad in Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. On the other hand, the Saudi rulers, as well as those in Egypt and Turkey, are Sunni. If their bitter enemy Iran, in this case the Saudis' bitter enemy Iran, will have nuclear weapons, they will be determined to get them as well. They have said as much. To the extent that President Obama and the United States are perceived by the Sunnis as being weak and not stopping Iran's nuclear program, then these longtime allies of the United States in the oil-rich Middle East will turn away from Washington, perhaps to Russia or China, or in a desperate desire to buy time, they'll cut their own short-term deals with Iran. The fourth guiding principle is that the sanctions previously imposed on Iran to stop them from developing nuclear weapons have worked. They have seriously crippled the Iranian economy. These sanctions were of two basic types: some which curtailed Iran's oil industry and the investment in that oil industry, and some which have restricted Iran's access to financial markets. However, these sanctions, unlike the ones that have existed since the start of the Islamic Republic and the taking of the hostages, these sanctions have been successful because the United States was able to persuade the Europeans, the Russians and Chinese, even the South Koreans and the Japanese, and even to some extent the Indians, to join us in imposing and implementing the sanctions. And this joint action is critical to their success. If the United States alone were imposing sanctions, they wouldn't have that effect. We've sanctioned Iran since 1979. It stopped nothing. Perhaps once we had the power to do that through unilateral sanctions imposed by us, we've seen how well it's worked on Cuba. That's being facetious there. French companies like Total, Chinese firms, they'll develop Iran's oil industry and buy Iranian oil and sell it to the rest of the world market where it mixes with other oil. Likewise, New York may be the financial capital of the world, and it is, but London, Singapore, Shanghai could fill much of that void if New York was closed off to Iran. Without joint action, U.S. threats and sanctions have much less credibility. Surprisingly, in the past, putting together this coalition, even Russia joined with us. In 2009, Russia had a contract to sell S-300 air defense systems to Iran, which would have made an Israeli attack on Iran far, far more difficult. Russia canceled that contract, voted for the Security Council resolution imposing sanctions. The Saudis and the Emirates both pumped substantially more oil to make up for the Iranian shortfall, and the rest of the world did not see huge increases in the cost of oil. Only the Iranian economy was crippled. President Obama deserves, and often doesn't get, credit for formulating and implementing this strategy. So against the backdrop of these guiding principles, I want to turn to the so-called interim agreement entered into in Geneva in November last year after weeks of intense negotiations. The parties negotiated on one side of the table were the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, US, Britain, France, Russia, China, and also Germany, known as the P5+1. On the other side was Iran. In that interim agreement, Iran committed to freeze its uranium enrichment program above 5%, in other words, not to enrich to more than 5%, and to dilute its stockpile of uranium enriched to 20%. Essentially, think of 90% as the level of enrichment you need to have nuclear material for an atomic bomb. They halted, so they agreed to freeze. They also agreed not to increase their enrichment capacity on this interim basis. Iran committed to leaving inoperable half of the centrifuges in place at Natanz and 3/4 of those at Fardao. Freeze activity, Iran agreed to freeze activity at its Iraq heavy water facility, which when built could produce plutonium for a nuclear weapon, and also agreed not to construct a facility capable of reprocessing plutonium from spent fuel. All those commitments are over the term of the interim agreement only. The agreement calls for intrusive monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, including daily access by IAEA inspectors at the key Iranian facilities. In return, the United States and its negotiating partners agreed to lift some of the economic sanctions. This interim deal has been estimated to have lifted about $7 billion per month of sanctions against Iran, a relatively small fraction of the costs that the remaining sanctions left on Iran are costing the Iranian economy. The parties committed to reach a comprehensive agreement in 6 months, by July 20th of this year. There's considerable ambiguity in the interim agreement. For example, Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif said that the agreement recognizes that Iran has a right to continue its enrichment program indefinitely. Secretary of State Kerry has said that is a matter for discussion in the talks about a comprehensive agreement. This interim agreement has been the subject of enormous controversy. Some have argued that Iranian President Rouhani and his Foreign Secretary Zarif are not sincere, that they are giving broad smiles to dupe the United States and its Western European allies into providing economic relief from the crippling sanctions while giving little in return. An article in the Wall Street Journal of November 25th states, Tehran surrendered little on nuclear matters and gained much economically. According to this viewpoint, Rouhani and Zarif will keep smiling, the interim agreement will never be finalized, and the sanctions noose will become looser and looser over time. Those supporting this position point to strident statements made by the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They also claim that the agreement still leaves Iran close to finalizing nuclear weapons, which it could quickly do, and nothing in it blocks Iran's development of long-range missiles to deliver those weapons. In contrast, the other view, the other side, others claim that Rouhani can point to the interim agreement and explain to the Iranian people, particularly the middle class, that he is improving their economic well-being. According to this view, the Supreme Leader, to whom Rouhani and Zarif report, will let Rouhani and Zarif finalize the agreement because it will greatly improve the lives of the Iranian people. By doing so, it will reduce the chances of a popular movement led internally by moderates in Iran, which would overthrow the Islamic Republic regime. After all, the first objective for this regime, as it is for all despots, is survival, to remain in power. According to this view, a struggle is going on for the heart and mind of the supreme leader. By obtaining the interim agreement, Rouhani demonstrated he can produce. If there is extensive delay and no permanent agreement, this will work to Rouhani's detriment because the sanctions relief he's gotten so far is modest. My own opinion is that the jury's still out on Rouhani's sincerity or whether the supreme leader will come down on his side at the end, assuming he is sincere, and whether a final agreement which will truly end Iran's effort to develop nuclear weapons is possible. I do believe, however, that there are meaningful restrictions on Iran in the interim agreement, specifically in limiting centrifuges and in freezing activities at the Iraq heavy water facility. That's worth something. Those are meaningful constraints on Iran. And the inspections which are being implemented on a daily basis at Iranian facilities are significant. On the other hand, the IAEA, which is conducting the inspections, has voiced its concerns that extensive weaponization activities may be taking place at a military site called Parchin, which is not being inspected. And the IAEA has also reported that Iran's production of enriched uranium has expanded over the past 3 months. Regardless of the benefits or the deficiencies of this interim agreement, it is merely a first step. The critical issue is what will happen in the next round of negotiations, now underway, directed towards a comprehensive agreement. Those are likely to be intense, difficult, and uncertain in outcome. Thus far, the parties have held some preliminary discussions and are just beginning to grapple with the critical issues. However, already it is clear that they are deeply divided on some critical core issues. The headline in the Washington Post proclaims, Iran assumes tough opening position on nuclear talks. For example, the Iranians have proclaimed that any agreement must recognize their right to enrich uranium. They assert that they will never dismantle their nuclear capability, which the United States desires as an objective of this agreement. Another crucial disagreement involves the proposal of the United States calling for a curtailment of Tehran's ballistic missile program. U.S. officials contend that the UN Security Council resolutions demand that Tehran suspend the missile program because it will be the vehicle for delivering nuclear weapons. The Iranians are adamant on this issue and believe it should not even be on the agenda. It is expected that any final agreement that is reached, when you get through all of the rhetoric, by and large, I think the prevailing view these days is that if there is a final agreement that is reached, it will permit Iran to enrich uranium at a level suitable for nuclear energy production, but not for weapons. The Prime Minister of Israel, many others, have voiced vehement objections to a result which allows them to continue to enrich. If an agreement is going to allow that, then there have to be safeguards which are enforceable constraints which effectively prevent Iran from quickly converting its nuclear program to weapons production or from hiding a parallel program. And in practice, this means that the advanced centrifuges, which can speed the level of enrichment so much more quickly than the first generation of centrifuges now primarily in use in those facilities, and they have the advanced centrifuges, those advanced centrifuges must be destroyed or mothballed, and that Iran has to make changes to a nuclear facility under construction the Iraq facility, so it cannot produce plutonium. Iran has signaled that it will never agree to those demands. For Iran, the ultimate decision on any agreement will be made not by Foreign Minister Zarif and not by Prime Minister Rouhani, but by the Supreme Leader. One day after the discussions began for a comprehensive agreement, Khamenei made a speech stating that he was not optimistic about the negotiations. In his words, it will not lead anywhere. This doesn't bode well, but it's not conclusive. leaders have said things and changed their positions. Equally troublesome is that some Western diplomats, including the European Foreign Policy Chief, Catherine Ashton, have already suggested that the 6-month deadline can be extended. That's not a way to begin the negotiations. It merely provides ammunition to those who contend that Iran has no intention of ever reaching an agreement, that they are simply going through the exercise to gain whatever relief they can from sanctions while they continue their nuclear weapon program, and in the same time try to divide the unity of those countries committed to the sanctions program and thereby weaken the existing sanctions that remain. Any extension of time should be only discussed late in the day, in July, if the parties are truly close to an agreement. Unquestionably, both sides face tremendous domestic pressure. For Rouhani, the Iranian middle class wants more economic relief. On the other hand, he cannot afford to alienate the supreme leader or jeopardize his presidency and indeed perhaps his life over this kind of question. There are forces, people, pretty hardline people. I'm not talking about people who have thought we could cut a grand bargain with Iran for many years. People who are pretty hardline say there is a true power fight going on at the highest levels of the Iranian regime between the hardliners and the reformers, that is real, that's not fake, that's not just a dance. President Obama, I talked about the pressures on Rouhani and Zarif, but President Obama also faces a strong bipartisan coalition in Congress who want an increase in sanctions, an intensification of the sanctions, if an agreement which ends Iran's nuclear program cannot be reached. To date, Obama has managed to persuade them not to pass legislation fixing a date for new sanctions, but that could change. The U.S. has allies, specifically Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are insisting, demanding that the agreement reached truly end Iran's nuclear program, and for them that means end the capacity to enrich uranium. And there is one more complication for these negotiations, if there weren't already enough. Russia, as I mentioned, played a useful and helpful role at various times during the building of this sanctions regime. Russia helped in the first round, leading to an interim agreement. Sometimes they were quite positive, other times they more took the Iranian position, but by and large, they were part of the coalition. But that was in November. A lot has happened involving Russia and Putin since that time in connection with the Ukraine and Crimea. It's not unreasonable to expect that Putin, now in an adversarial relationship with Obama over Crimea and Ukraine, will not be helpful. It is likely he will want to make it's likely he'll want to make Obama pay a price for his opposition to Russian policy in Ukraine and Crimea. One way of doing that may be to obstruct the negotiations with Iran. But I don't think it is certain that he will choose this course, because to the extent you attribute to Putin a sort of total realpolitik agenda, I'm not sure why it's in his interest to let this thing fall by the wayside and go to that next stage. Looking ahead, there are 4 possible scenarios. The first is the parties reach a truly meaningful agreement, pursuant to which Iran commits to do what is necessary to end its nuclear weapons program, and that agreement is subject to intensive, intrusive verification. The second is that the parties reach an ambiguous agreement, which does not in fact end the Iranian program, but permits both sides to say they achieved something. Third is that the negotiations drag on for months inconclusively. And the fourth, of course, is that the negotiations break off in failure. If this latter occurs, and perhaps even if the latter doesn't occur and the negotiations just drag on, Congress will undoubtedly pass new legislation reinstating the sanctions that have been suspended, but more importantly, significantly increase the sanctions, tightening the sanctions around Iran. The question will be whether the U.S. can persuade its European allies to follow this approach. That's an open question in the view of many, because the benefits which the Europeans, whose economies are also hurting, will see from trade with Iran. Another question is whether Israel would launch a military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. That can't be predicted with any certainty. Similarly, President Obama, who clearly prefers, and wisely so, a strategy for a diplomatic resolution of this issue, has said on a number of occasions he will take whatever action is necessary to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Many are skeptical. I know they're skeptical in Israel. I know they're skeptical in Saudi Arabia. And I believe there are a lot of people in the United States who are skeptical. But for reasons I'm not going to develop here, we can get into them later if you want, I think he means what he says. And I added in parenthesis, Syria notwithstanding. What the U.S. does have in this is a powerful weapon in our economic muscle and our access to U.S. markets. We can not only impose those sanctions on Iranian firms, but do as we have done already, impose them on any foreign firms which do business with Iran. We should use that leverage to our advantage in the negotiations. The Iranians have already seen our sanctions can bite. We should continue aggressively to press that advantage with Iran and our European allies to forge a meaningful agreement. We're only going to succeed in this with Iran if we bargain from strength, not weakness, and it's very important that we succeed in these negotiations. There are a number of issues here I've not delved into. Perhaps we'll get into some of them in the discussion, but I do want to thank you very much for inviting me to come here tonight.
Let me suggest that people write out their questions and maybe pass the cards to the end of the aisles, hold them up. Someone will come around and collect them, and they'll be brought up to me. But I'm gonna take the prerogative of being up here and ask a question or two to begin with while those questions are being brought up. And my first one is this. I want to try to put you on the spot a bit, Congressman. If you mentioned President Obama saying he would take whatever action is necessary, if Iran were to continue with its program and reach the point or be about to reach the point of being a threshold nuclear power, is a military strike, either by the United States or by Israel, would that be advisable? Would it be possible? Is it possible to destroy the Iranian nuclear program? Is that something that, at the end of the day, you think we may have to do? Or our close ally, Israel?
Look, it's a very important question. And I will give it a long answer.
Yeah, please do.
First, the definition of the issue. What the president has said is, I will not let Iran acquire nuclear weapons. And I will use any means at my disposal, and very clearly, military options are at his disposal, to stop them from getting that. He has said it publicly, he has said it privately, he said it in personal conversations I've had, and this is a huge issue in terms of his administration. This may not come to a head before he leaves office, but a president who has made that statement that often, that clearly, that precisely, and then doesn't do it, is a president who I think will be viewed as having had a failed foreign policy. The leader of the United States cannot do that, parenthesis, putting aside Syria, which is different. Secondly, what is the test of having a nuclear weapon? We have no evidence that Iran has built a nuclear weapon. We have all kinds of evidence that they have acquired and developed the designs, for a nuclear warhead, the triggering devices, the miniaturization that would be needed to put a warhead on a missile, not to mention massively developed and increased their enrichment capabilities. So what is the point in which you say they've gone beyond developing a nuclear weapon program, and how do you define a nuclear weapon capability? I think saying, we'll do it before they have the bomb is too late. To me, the test is, in a hypothetical, they kick out the inspectors, they turn off the cameras, and we no longer know what level they are enriching to in Natanz or Fordow. The time between they doing that and having a nuclear weapon is not long, and to me, that's the test. That has to be the test of when we can say you can no longer assume that we will know precisely when they'll actually get the nuclear weapon, and we have to do something. And then, no, that will not end Iran's nuclear weapons program. It will set it back. It will also have many repercussions, some of which are going to be very dangerous for the United States, for our allies. We have forces there. They have their own series of potential responses. How they will respond if we were to engage in that kind of an attack on certain key facilities, and the question of who's doing it is very important here, because as strong as Israel's capabilities are, the U.S. has far superior capabilities, particularly as to the Fordow facility, which is buried in the mountainside. But no, you're buying time with that. You're not stopping it.
And I'm going to go to audience questions in a minute, but let me ask you one other question. So it seems to me, not being an expert on this, that one of the critical questions about how important it is to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is whether or not Iran would act rationally. I mean, we lived in a world for half a century where people who were our enemy, if you will, the Soviet Union, possessed lots of nuclear weapons. We assumed that they were rational, that mutual assured destruction would stop people from using nuclear weapons. On the other hand, many people fear that North Korea, for instance, is basically led by irrational people who might use a nuclear weapon and could not be deterred. This is really putting you on the spot, but is the Iranian leadership rational, and would it be possible to deter them from either developing a nuclear weapon or using one if they had one through rational deterrence?
My primary concern is less the likelihood of Iran using it. There's enough rationality there. The regime wants to survive. That's a rational desire. A number of countries have made rational decisions to try and develop nuclear weapons. Was India's decision rational in the context of what China had? Was Pakistan's rational in the context of what India had developed? Israel, you can make a rational case for it. I'm not here saying we do this because they're bad guys that they're doing this. They are violating, I think, their treaty obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm doing it because of the threat, and I think the other reasons for it, beyond the use of nuclear weapons, are just as important in terms of U.S. security interests. Iran is the hegemon of the region. The collapse of the non-proliferation regime, the likelihood that nuclear weapons, the likelihood of use, to me, goes up more than percentage-wise when other countries start developing their own nuclear weapons capability. And when you add Turkey and Iran and Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and whoever else decides to get this, we're on a long way from this notion of trying to reach that goal of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and reduce nations' reliance on nuclear weapons. The likelihood of that use, whether by one of those countries or by terrorists, is enhanced so much that I think that's an even stronger reason not to let Iran get this.
Okay, let's go to some questions from the audience. The first is, you talked a lot about sanctions and their success or not. The first question is, how successful was the cyber attack in delaying Iran's enrichment program? Should we consider repeating this type of, quote, warfare?
By cyber attack, you mean Stuxnet?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Everything I know makes me think it clearly had, it delayed it. It didn't stop it, but it delayed it. It pushed it back. It messed it up. And my assumption is, without knowing anything about this, that we're looking at all kinds of other ways of undermining the viability of that program through covert means. But again, like the military option, it's not a program that will end it. It's just an effort to buy more time. And why are we trying to buy more time? Well, sometimes more time is better than the confrontation, and more time can lead to other resolutions and internal things going on in Iran. Although I've never been one who believes that the internal capability of the opponents of the regime to mass an uprising that is going to depose the regime is very imminent.
You talked a little about this already, but maybe you can expand on this in some detail. If negotiations fail, what are the options for further sanctions against Iran? Would they significantly tighten the screws? And I'll add to that, would they, how effective can tougher sanctions be in forcing the Iranians to abandon their program?
Well, we look at what this level of sanctions has done to the Iranian economy. Oil exports, by far the biggest source of foreign currency and the most profitable part of their whole industrial enterprise, have been cut in half. Multiply the 1 million barrels a day times the price of oil, and you get a little sense of what that cost has been to Iran. It's been enormous. Cutting it an additional 50% just adds to it. You see what's going on with the currency and the inflation rate there. You see the anger and the protests as they try to deal with their government expenditures by reducing the subsidies they've been providing for Iranians to purchase refined petroleum, which Iran does not have the capacity to refine in sufficient numbers to meet the needs of their own people. They have really been hurting. This played a huge role, I think, in the recalibration in the talks, in coming to the interim agreement. This was sanctions used to try and maximize the chance of resolving this diplomatically. One thing about the Obama administration and the Congress and the sanctions, he started out with something that on its face seemed very naive. I'll hold out my hand to the regime, to the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, the Iranian regime. You unclench your fist and we'll try to resolve our differences. How could he think that regime, with Ahmadinejad as its president and the supreme leader's past history, was possibly interested in that solution? I don't think that's what he thought. I think he thought the current policy, the policy we've been involved in for the last 8 years before that, and even longer, where we had some unilateral sanctions, many of which we never imposed on foreign companies, and referred to Iran as the axis of evil, and had enormous rhetoric about how evil and terrible this regime was, nothing was happening. By the end of 2008, America was isolated in terms of its Iran policy, and Iran was rising, in some part because of our decisions in Iraq. And this strategy, which offered the diplomatic resolution on a whole range of issues, but most particularly the nuclear issue, and watching it being turned down and spurned by Iran, coupled with the their own actions in 2009 in repressing the voices of the people during the voting and counting the ballots, and then in the demonstrations afterwards, created an international support base plus effective diplomacy, bilateral, over and over again with different key countries, where serious time was spent in engagements with the Chinese leadership and Medvedev and the Russian leadership to build support for the international sanctions. And that created the level of pressure that has put Iran in these problems. So there's a lot more one could do in the sanction sphere, on the purchase of petroleum, on a greater effort to constrain their ability to use financial markets in other industries, and in undoing the relief we gave them for the interim agreement.
You mentioned in your talk the idea that if Iran were to reach the nuclear threshold, that Saudi Arabia would certainly do the same thing. And this question goes to that. If Iran became a nuclear power, wouldn't continued U.S. political relations with partner nations in the Middle East and the associated U.S. nuclear umbrella reduce the likelihood of a nuclear weapons race in the region?
In theory, there's a case to be made for that. In reality, take a look at the behavior of the Saudis and the Emirates in terms of the United States just entering into negotiations with Iran. They are very, very skeptical now about U.S. support, about the security umbrella. And I have to say, Syria didn't help there. Red lines were drawn and then ignored. So I'm not sure how much credibility we have there, that if and then, of course, that also doesn't deal with their own desire and intention of getting nuclear weapons, because in the end, they'll want that as the deterrent.
You talked about...
I mean, in a way,
the
security umbrella, I mean, why does Japan not develop nuclear weapons? Because they have our security relationship, and South Korea. These are countries... Japan, if it wanted to, has the capabilities. In fact, Iranians have said, we want to be like Japan, except not in terms of behavior, but in terms of capabilities. If Japan decided tomorrow they wanted nuclear weapons, within 6 months they could have them. They know every aspect of how to do that.
You talked a little bit about the U.S.-Russian tension and how that might impact things. One of the questions is, do you see a role for China in the nuclear weapons negotiation? Can China impact or influence the Iranian regime as a third party? So obviously they are involved in the P5+1, but what role do the Chinese play specifically, and is it an important one going forward?
Well, China does have a role. China is very important for Iran as a purchaser of Iranian oil. Even though they have cut back how much they purchase, they are still probably the most significant purchaser of Iranian oil. So they have leverage. China's always been very quiet on these kinds of things. They have the ability to deliver a message. They've really tried to avoid. They want to clean up afterwards. They're not trying to be, front and center, the focus of attention. But China played helpful roles actually in putting together the original sanctions at different times.
Let me do probably 2 more questions, maybe 3. I think I know what your answer to this is going to be, but one of them is, you spoke of your concerns about nuclear proliferation, going back again to a sort of arms race situation. Iran and the Arab states have proposed a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. That would, of course, require Israel to give up its nuclear weapons. Israel and the U.S. have announced their opposition to this proposal. What is your view?
Yeah, my view is that it would be, first of all, I'm much more of the school that, and of the position that Obama has endorsed, which was formulated in a way by Kissinger and Perry. We want to reduce everywhere towards the goal of eliminating reliance on nuclear weapons. Regional zones, I don't think are that important. Secondly, there's no way in the world Israel is going to give up the nuclear capability is never admitted it has, absent a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. By the way, it isn't the Israeli capability, which has existed for a very long time, the consensus of opinion is, that is causing the Saudis to want to develop nuclear weapons, or the Egyptians, or the Turks. It's the Iranian development of nuclear weapons that is. So to that extent, Israel's activities have not massively endangered the non-proliferation regime the way Iranian success would.
Let's do one final question. It's from somebody who's very pessimistic. I hate to end on this note, but what is the scariest possibility in your view? What should cause me to worry the most? What's the worst? I think we know the best outcome. You talked about that. What's the worst outcome?
The earthquake. No.
They're due for one in that area.
And so are we. I'm from Los Angeles, remember. The Russians like to say, I heard this many times, I spent a lot of time in 2008, 9, and 10 going to Moscow and in Washington meeting with Russian leaders and leaders in the Duma about Iran. And they like to say, we have two horrors in this regard. The horror of Iran with a nuclear weapon, and then for them, what we think is worse, a war over Iran having a nuclear weapon and the spillover effects. I think those are two horrible possibilities, but after Iraq, I will never underestimate the dangers and unforeseen consequences that will come. Can I tell a story about this, just to illustrate the point? Huge numbers of people, particularly Republicans and hawks, thought that George Bush, sometime before he left office, was going to either give the okay to the Israelis or himself undertake a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. In 2006, Brzezinski wrote an op-ed piece, and I was in LA for the weekend and I read it, and talking about if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's a duck. This Bush administration is planning to attack Iran. And then he said, and if they do, here are the consequences of that attack. And he listed from Hezbollah rockets into Israel to our ships in the Persian Gulf to our bases in Bahrain to tourists and other allied interests all through the region, to riots in the streets of every major city, Muslim city, and throughout the Muslim world, not just in Iran or in the Arab world. And he said, these are the consequences of that attack. And I brought that article back because I had a meeting that morning at the White House. And I gave it to Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor. And I said, read this, because you're coming over to the Hill the afternoon to meet with a group. We had an Iran study group on the Hill to meet with us. And I'd just like your reaction to what he said. And he comes over and he says, even though I didn't like Brzezinski's attacks on my boss and the way he talked about him, and even though, and he was one of my teachers when I was in school, the fact is, if anything, he understates the consequences of that attack. which made me conclude the Bush administration had absolutely no intention of going after Iran. They had enough on their plate. They were not going to do that. But so I only tell that story to say I don't take lightly the issue of what happens if there's an attack on Iran, but I take even more seriously what happens if Iran gets the nuclear weapon.
I think we'll end on that kind of pessimistic note. If I didn't get to your question, please ask the congressman afterwards. I'm sure he'll be happy to chat with folks. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking you. Thank you very much.